I was at an AI conference in the early 80s, and on a panel with Marvin Minsky and Jim Hogan and Bob Sheckley. And so we're talking about AI sorts of things, and it occurred to me something that I'm sure has occurred to most people at that meeting also, which was that the most spectacular feature of AI was not just making something that would be as smart as a human. That's the most incredible, perhaps, but the most spectacular outcome would be creating minds that were more intelligent in all ways than humans, and that actually would be a different sort of technological advance than advances in the past, because it would actually change the thing that is the top creative element in technological progress. And since it would be beyond human intelligence, there's a certain unknowability about what sort of events would happen after that point. And so I think it really was at that time for me that I thought of the metaphor with the singularity in particular, as it's used with black holes and general relativity, that there was reflecting this fact that there's not very much information that you can imagine for after that point in time when superhuman intelligence has come into place. So that was the reason for it, and it just occurred to me as we were talking on the panel, and the metaphor, I think, is actually quite a good metaphor. It also ties in with the use of the singularity in mathematics, which is basically a place where your model breaks or does not apply, and that's also a situation that appears to be true if we had superhuman inventiveness. Right, and oftentimes people make the point that the invention of the printing press or the invention of fire is a singularity, and I would agree with that, although I don't think the metaphor applies quite so well, because although the consequences of fire and agriculture and the printing press were not predictable, those consequences would be understandable to a person from the before time. They might not believe the consequences, but they would understand what your assertions were. On the other hand, talking about something in the post-singularity future after the rise of superhuman intelligence, that analogy of explanation would be more like explaining our world to a chimpanzee or a goldfish. So there is, to me, a fundamentally more extreme technological change involved with this particular advance compared to advances in the past. There are analogies in the past, I think. The rise of humankind within the animal kingdom, and arguably the rise of multicellular life on Earth, life itself. So there's some very big transformational changes that have occurred in the past. Actually, talking about evolution in these issues is interesting. I think that what humans have done is, as you say, a very interesting change on the approach to problem solving. The bacteria actually have done a pretty good job of being inventive, and they still are very inventive. And I think they also illustrate that the bacteria illustrate that there is more to evolution than competition and the phrase "nature bloody in tooth and claw." There's more to evolution than that. There's an awful lot of cooperation that is involved with evolution. And of course, the good things that humans do also illustrate that. the goal setting that humans and post-humans can undertake is certainly a much more, certainly something new in its intensity, but I think that and in fact, the goal setting is one of the chief things that distinguishes the human and the post-human eras from the past. Without the goal setting, though, the sorts of things that happen in evolution in terms of cooperation and competition actually are a form of data processing, and it's as though the computation and the testing is being done at the reality itself is being used to make the testing. It's where the reasoning is going on, and so that it's not perhaps reasoning as we recognize it, but the overall effect, although it is slow, is the effect. It has the appearance of being a goal set, but I do agree that it is not goal set. Actually, the version you already got is sort of my expounded version. That the technological singularity is a different sort of technological advance than in the past, and that it's a different sort of advance because it is an improvement in the things that are doing the creativity, and that sets it apart from all human inventions of the past, although not from all biological inventions, as we were discussing. You are certainly right that there's really a lot of definitions for the singularity, and even within the folks that are talking about technological singularity in terms of intelligence, even there are sort of different takes on it. For instance, and I think Eleazar Yudkowsky has written an essay on this where he talks about the three or four major ways that people look at the singularity. The metaphor and the unknowability aspect is one angle. There are people, though, that don't think it's going to be unknowable at all. And certainly if you were one of the participants, if you became one of the super smart creatures, then presumably things would not be any more unintelligible to you than they are to unenhanced humans. There's also the notion that many years ago was brought up by Stan Ulam and von Neumann, that if technology advanced fast enough, just the speed with which technology was advancing would count as a singularity. And I think that that's true, although if we didn't get the technological singularity that we've been talking about in terms of superhuman intelligence, then the fact that we humans have been able to make more and more inventions faster and faster, that would probably level out. In other words, as we exceeded, as the things that we invented became more complex and more advanced, if there was not also an increase in the intelligence of the players, then you would get the sort of world that I'm blocking on the name, but there's a molecular biologist in the 80s.
Drexler?
No. There's a molecular biologist in the 70s and 80s who wrote a book called The End of Progress, The Coming Golden Age. And he argued that the efflorescence of complexity and detail in our culture and in our inventions was evidence that we were reaching the end of the road in terms of our ability to do inventions, because we had just exhausted what we could do. If you look at my 1992 essay that I gave at NASA, in the bibliography for that I have the name of this fellow, and to me his vision is very appropriate. If we don't get superhuman intelligence, that by itself, I think, will cause a leveling off in what we can invent. So the rise of humanity within the animal kingdom, I think, definitely counts as an analogous event to the technological singularity. It is an analogous event that may not be entirely helpful in imagining things. In other words, what happens could be very, very different. And one thing going forward in science fiction is science fiction writers, I like to say, are the first group that was impacted by this event, the singularity, even if it doesn't happen, because they have to write. If they want to write about the near future, they at least have to have a reason why the singularity did not happen, just to satisfy their readers. And as time goes forward, and it's getting into the teen years of the 21st century, we are seeing more and more science fiction writers who are actually kind of looking into the singularity, not avoiding it. And I think as technology goes forward, we're actually going to have insights about how this might be different than in the past, in past great changes. I think the language was supported in terms of explaining well enough so that this individual could operate, and the consequences of doing certain things in the technological world could be explained. Now, it is true that within a single human lifetime, it might not be possible to make understandable the internals of what's going on. But that's true of us. I mean, probably neither of us understand all the stuff that's going on inside the cameras that you're using. You know very well how to use the cameras, and that's something that I think could be taught to me or to an Amazonian who had no contact with cameras before. Oh, and by extension, think about undertaking the same exercise with a chimpanzee or a gorilla. Very limited success, and much more limited success if you were working with a toad or a goldfish. The way to bias the odds to get a beneficial singularity, I think, is to engage people in the internet and recognize what certain things like user interface design, which is really intelligence amplification, recognize what these things are, and so depend on the millions of people who are engaged thinking about these things. I don't think it requires. In fact, I strongly don't think it requires a crash government project. This is something that is just a natural thing that is happening and can be made a lot safer and beneficial if a lot of people are involved and thinking about it. If a person was actively interested in making things go wrong, even that might be a little bit difficult, because hurrying this sort of progress is like the cat ripping forward through the future. We already are ripping forward through the future as fast as we can. Spending money deliberately to make it go still faster is when we don't know exactly what it is we're supposed to do, and is just spending money on the basis of a small number of people's intuition about what the right thing to do is. Small number of people, unless they happen to be just exactly the right people that have the right idea, is not going to do any special added good. It's the ensemble demand and the intelligence of the whole race that actually has a chance of picking out the bright winners. So in the end, looking back, you'll find that there are some individuals who really got it dead right all along. On the other hand, there are probably people that wouldn't be given more than taxi change in order to fund their efforts. So having a big government thing that decides where you're going to put the money to make these things happen is actually just a guarantee of slowing things down. I think that there are probably projects that would be sort of dangerous. A military arms race would probably be dangerous. In fact, one of the stories that I eventually would like to write is, this would be modeled after the interactions between the Soviet Union and the USA toward the end of World War II and in the following 10 years, where there was, both sides were trying to make nuclear weapons. One side was ahead, the other side eventually substantially caught up, and in fact, in some areas, the Soviet nuclear weapons thing was ahead for a while. But imagine that was for military AI. In that case, as they get closer to, making things work, the spies on both sides, which presumably exist just as they existed in the 1940s, the spies on both sides are relaying critical information to the other side. In some cases, the information is just, oh, such and such an approach really works. And things go faster and faster. So in that case, if there's anything dangerous you can do that make things go faster, it will happen. And so in this story, you can imagine that, at 9 o'clock at night, you hear your spies, at this point, slightly superhuman spies, are telling you, the other side is going to have this by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And suddenly, your willingness to be cautious has evaporated because you're trying to get to 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So a military arms race sounds bad. Frankly, the most dangerous thing I think the human race faces at the present time is not related to any of this, and it's not really related to technology, new technology. The most dangerous thing the human race faces is just plain old nuclear war between large nations. So I don't mean just a single bomb here and there. I mean thousands and thousands of weapons set off by coordinated efforts, by whole nations. I think it's just an accident we got through the 20th century. So if people has an existential threat they really want to worry about, to me that's the most likely, and the singularity stuff is mostly a very positive thing. I say that I think the technological singularity it may not happen at all. It could be stopped by nuclear war. If it does happen, I'd be surprised if it hasn't happened by 2030, and that I think it's the most likely non-catastrophic outcome for technology in that period. Most likely non-catastrophic outcome. And actually, if you parse that sentence carefully, it doesn't necessarily say what sort of catastrophic outcomes I'm talking about. It is conceivable that the singularity itself could be a very bad thing. I can't rule that out because I don't know what the future is like. But I think there's a lot of other things around, as I've just been talking about, that are clearly catastrophic, like widespread nuclear war. So the phrasing that it's the most likely non-catastrophic event, I think actually captures all the ambiguity properly. Scenario-based planning has become a very popular, and I think justifiably popular, method for thinking about the future by serious non-science fiction people. So the notion is that no one knows what the future will bring, and there are various surprising things that could happen. We don't know which of those things that will happen. So with scenario-based planning, you get classically you get together a committee that brings expertise to the table from various areas, and they try to think of some of the most extraordinary outcomes that they can for the general area that they're studying. And the usual way that this works is they try to think of different things that, well, what is the most extreme thing that could happen with this trend? What is the most extreme thing that could happen with this combination of two trends? And these don't have to be, in contrast to planning in the past, these scenarios don't have to be what anyone in the committee thinks is the main thing that's going to happen. They're supposed to be the most extreme things that they can imagine happening within the scope of what is feasible. Once they've got 4 or 5 such scenarios, then reasoning back from those endpoints, they try to imagine how the world could have gotten into those dramatically different situations. The result, when this works, the result is some very well thought out ways that the world could end up in a very surprising situation. The classic case of this was back in the first oil crunch, that most planners were convinced that oil prices were going to go up to $100 a barrel. This is a long time ago. And that was the very high oil prices was the received wisdom. One group, though, did not disagree with that, but they were doing scenario-based planning. So they had on their scenario list a scenario in which oil prices did not get super high. Unlikely, even they probably thought that was unlikely. But once they had the scenario, work out the steps that might happen in getting to that scenario, and in an operational way, even more important, think of the symptoms that would tell you that maybe you were in one of these surprising scenarios. So the next step after having made those symptom lists is to lay them out, and as time goes forward, you watch the various symptoms that are showing up in the real world. And some of these symptoms will make one scenario more likely than it was before, or less likely than it was before. And so going forward, monitoring this with whatever other forecasting and planning tools you have, you are using this information to sort of fine-tune your assessment of the relative probabilities of these situations. In principle, it could even be used for action planning. In other words, you rank both the likelihood of the scenarios, and you rank how good or bad those scenarios would be for you, how much you're willing to do to try to deal with a scenario, and the events that would happen as you go toward each of those scenarios. You can use those perhaps to help you plan in such a way that you can postpone irrevocable decisions for as long as possible. And in fact, I think in our present era, that is actually a very important principle. There are certain things that once you've committed yourself to, you can't back out of, and they're very, very expensive. On the other hand, if you don't know what's going on, it's cool to be able to postpone those irrevocable decisions. So in some cases, you might have several scenarios that are possible, and you're doing things that will leave you well positioned for all of them. And you can sort of order your priorities according to that. Now, this certainly does have a connection with aspects of science fiction writing. Hard science fiction tries to, for instance, look at the world and reason logically in the presence of radical assumptions. The difference between important difference between hard science fiction and scenario building is that the hard science fiction is designed to entertain. In fact, that's its, in my opinion, that's its chief goal. And as a result, one can reasonably argue that it's not nearly as important to serious scenario-based planning folks as what they do with their groups. In fact, I think that both science fiction writers and the scenario-based planners realize that there is a interesting and important advantage that comes with the science fiction for entertainment aspect. It's a disadvantage because it means you may exceed the bounds of rationality occasionally, but it is the advantage that it grabs the reader's emotions. A good story almost always grabs the reader's emotions, engages the reader. And the term in science fiction is that it causes the reader to willingly suspend their disbelief about things that they might otherwise be much more skeptical about. And this means that that if you can succeed in that, in addition to perhaps persuading the reader of something they didn't believe before, but in addition to that, if the reader is looking at what you're saying sympathetically, then the reader's intelligence is being engaged in making the scenario more plausible, thinking of reasons why the scenario might be more plausible. And that's a very important feature, because when you look at a scenario, if it is overtly incredible, then if you have no other reason to look at it, there is a powerful human incentive to just not pay any attention to it. If, on the other hand, you're engaged with it enough to say, okay, this is really cool, and I don't understand why such and such could really happen. This explanation is not plausible. On the other hand, if you are engaged with the characters, you may be a very smart reader, and you may be very specialized, have very specialized knowledge, that reader, may actually be able to think of reasons that no one had thought about before for why these events could happen, or some events similar, effectively the same, could happen. Yeah, and actually, I shouldn't be too adamant about separating the scenario-based planning from the writing, since actually serious scenario-based planners, one thing, it's not the most important thing on their agenda, but one thing they try to do is to write an engaging story that describes each of the scenarios, kind of how it developed, and ideally they would like it to be a story so engaging that it engages the emotions in the positive way that I was talking about before. So, okay, so I think I understand what you mean by narrative. Yeah, I think that what's happening with education and the internet and Khan Academy and what Stanford is doing and what MIT is doing and I think Harvard is doing, putting this stuff out there is revolutionary, and we're only just beginning to see the effects. I used to be a little bit down on the notion of mere humans, but the fact is we haven't yet made a machine that can pass the Turing test. And at the same time, we have 7 billion such devices out there. They're doing fine, and they're self-sufficient, and for the most part, and they're already there, and taking advantage of that resource, and that resource taking advantage of things for self, that is humanity and the internet together. It's not going to make governments obsolete, but the thing is, it makes the intellect of governments and the expertise. We have experts for that sort of thing, and they're all sort of cloistered away within governments and universities. It makes that laughable. So I think that the educational stuff is far more important than what currently I, as a writer, spend most of my time sort of boggling about, and that is e-books and electronic publishing, which is revolutionary for my industry. But the revolution in education is going to be at least as painful or more painful for the current practitioners, but the ultimate outcome is 3 or 4 orders of magnitude more payoff than public education in the past. And public education, I don't think there's too much argument about it. As a principle, educating broad numbers of people is one of the big things that boosted us out of the dark times of all history before. And the thing is, the vast majority of people are good-hearted and constructive. They have their own goals. The thing is, those goals and they know this. Their goals benefit, for the most part, by other people cooperating because they have goals. And so, to me, I think this is still an open question, but it seems to me this trumps the fact that there are a small number of people who like to break things. And it's much easier to break wonderful things than it is to make wonderful things. But at the same time, there are so many more makers than there are breakers that last 5 years or so, I've actually come to have some real hope for the makers winning out over the breakers. Scenario-based planning, I think, overall is very popular with serious organizations, like Global Business Network. And I don't know to what extent it's actually being used overall, throughout all industries. But I think it really has taken hold in situations where they have to plan, or they have to at least think, even though they know they may not be able to plan in detail, but they have to think about things that are more than 5 years away. At that situation, you're looking at this, this incredible landscape of possibilities. And in fact, all other things aside, technologically, I think it's always been true that if you haven't thought of a technological possibility, that is, if the human race hasn't thought about it, or if it doesn't think it's possible, that actually is a powerful reason why it's not going to happen very fast. And I think that's the chief reason why technology moves slowly for ages, and why things like slavery hung on. Back in the time of the Greeks, there was Hero's steam engine, which you've probably seen pictures of. There were people who had made steam engines. They were toys. Part of that is because of material science and the strength of materials and things like that. But I think part of it was that the notion of doing something much better than had been done before, what slaves could do. Well, we have slaves for that. Why do we need, this steam thing? The notion that being able to think something is possible is one of the biggest steps to making it happen. And there are some extensions to that. For instance, one reason why the future is hard to scope out is that, at least for the good things, if we could think of, if we did have a very good idea about what the future could bring, it would happen almost right now, because we'd cut to the chase and do it. And one thing that is speeding up technology is the fact that people now have a very broad idea of what is possible, and they are thinking about the future very intensely. And so that means they're grabbing the fabric of reality and dragging it toward them in a way that was really just outside the scope of thought more than 500 years ago. There still would be the notion of exponential progress. This is not inconsistent with that, but I think one of the chief things that is driving this stage of it is the final, our realization of these factors about thinking about the future and inventing things. Among science fiction writers, that is a famous, difficult problem. How do you write about good things? I think also, to me, this question about utopias ties in with the other angle of the negative side. You said, well, there's going to be time in your documentary where we're going to talk about the downside and the terrible. And that is that the singularity brings up the attainment of goals that humans have had for possible attainment of goals that humans have had for a very long time. And the idea that something like those goals might be attainable, really attainable, is a fact that forces people to think about what they meant by those goals. It was all very easy to talk about these goals when there was no possibility short of religious possibility for attaining those goals. Now that perhaps these goals are possible, we are forced to look at them. And some of the most optimistic and desirable goals, when you actually dissect them and look at them closely, they really resolve into questions that are frightening. And the easiest one of those to talk about is just living forever. Most people, when they think about living forever, there's really kind of this nebulous thing of like 300 or 400 years, which is really, in my opinion, no problem at all. I mean, it's not. It would be a wonderful thing to happen to society. Forget about happening to individuals. I think it would. There really would be improvements in society if human lifespan was on the order of 1,000 years. All sorts of good things would happen. 10,000 years, okay, that's also imaginable. But when you start talking about living for 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000,000 years, really long periods of time, which is itself nothing like forever, but it's still a long period of time. At that point, even the most assured optimist is actually sucked into discussions of what it is to have, what self is. And having to truly confront that, to me, probably the only way to live 1,000,000,000 years is that you would have to become something greater than you are now. And that gets into issues of, is that still you? I think the amount of improvement that you'd have to enjoy 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years, you'd arguably would be the same person. But when you talk about very long periods of time, then this raises scary questions. So some of the scariness of that some people have about the thing, some of the uneasiness is really related to the fact that it is so optimistic. Other things about it are I think scary because the idea that they might happen soon is scary. The notion that 10,000 years from now, for instance, humanity might grow up to be something better is, most of us would have a warm and fuzzy feeling about the notion that 10,000 years from now, all human striving would lead to something that was better. If, on the other hand, it were to happen before you retire from your profession, that's something that is more uneasy making. So there's a lot of things here that are uneasy making, but it sort of comes with the territory. Right. I think there are things that that it is important to be thinking about what we want, and it is important to be thinking about the future. I think it's also important to be flexible in that what actually happens is not necessarily going to be because of our particular planning. We are in a situation where I think that as the chief intellectual players in the world, I'm talking about humans, we are in a position to use this stuff to make things most likely to come out in a way that is palatable to us. And in fact, to me, one of the paths to the singularity is the team behavior of humans and their computer systems. So this is related to intelligence amplification and internet and crowdsourcing and things like that. And that's already more powerful than any intellectual institution of the past. And I suspect that it's going to be one of the first superhuman things that are out there, seriously superhuman. And that's going to be a situation where people can make a significant difference. So the fact that we can't control the future or make it come out exactly as we wish, we are in a situation where we can have a chance of guiding it into situations that have a moral and safety dimension that is acceptable to us. Talking about what's not obvious in the future, if the singularity happens, then I think it's almost by definition very difficult to answer that question. Although as time goes forward and we do acquire more intellectual abilities, as with crowdsourcing and group minds and the internet and symbiotic cooperation with machines, I think that there will be insights. So other than that, I don't have much to say about the future. On the other hand, the first part of your question about the past, what are big things that got missed that are surprising that they got missed? Well, I commented earlier about just not thinking that something is possible is a powerful way of not getting it, as with the steam engines a long time ago. I'm actually kind of been interested in that question of what big things were surprisingly missed. And and part of the answer depends on how much you know about the history of science, because it turns out that an awful lot of stuff has been thought about. If you go back into small enough corners, it's stretched out across time. It's almost like the spatial richness that we have now with the internet. An awful lot of people thought about an awful lot of things. You can find Joe Blow in the year 1200. Oh yeah, he thought about all of this. And so I take the question about big things that were missed as kind of big things that you don't see much in the historical record, and perhaps you could find it. But one thing that seems to me, and I would like to talk to a historian of science about this, who might completely disabuse me of this thought, is the germ theory of disease. The germ theory of disease is something that it seems to me comes immediately if you have the principle of mediocrity. The principle of mediocrity, roughly speaking, is that we're not at the center of things. We're probably sort of an average case, and so this is a reason for thinking there might be life on other worlds, because we're not central. It's a reason for thinking that maybe the Earth is not the center of the universe. Also, we see animals that are bigger than us in the world, a lot bigger. We see animals that are smaller than us. On the other hand, our eyes don't allow us to see things that are too enormous. And even more obviously, our eyes don't let us see things that are very, very small. And so it seems to me that a philosopher, say at the time of Plato or Socrates, could have said, well, as small as I can see, and there are things that some people can see and other people can't see. They're just little mites. As far as I can see, there are smaller and smaller animals. And I do know that animals fight and they eat each other and they do bad things. And I see a lot of small animals once I start looking. So what is there to mean that there aren't animals smaller than I can see? Instead, historically, we have the notion of disease spirits and vapors and things like that. But the notion that there is just fleas on top of fleas on top of fleas, even that did not reach the I don't think reach the important conclusion is, what does that say about disease? That disease could be simply being about behemoth being ravaged by very small animals. If that had been as popular as some theories, then the notion of boiling water without any further experimentation, or just as a classical Greek thought experiment, the notion of boiling water as a disease defense would have been reasonable. I am very much in favor of pragmatism and experimentalism, and what I just talked through is none of that. It's just your classic idea that you can think about everything from first causes, which I am very unsympathetic toward. But I am surprised that the people who were very enthusiastic about reasoning from first principles did not arrive at something like the attitude toward disease that grew up in the late 1800s.
Yeah, I think the Greeks actually had a concept of miasmus.
Yeah.
And it was a physical form of evil that anybody, even innocent people who'd come in contact with it, like somebody cleaning up the dead, would be punishment would seek them.
Right. So so there was that, and it just seems to me that's so close to getting something that would actually give them a substantive behavior, that is boiling water, before you allow the critters to get into you.
Yeah. I mean, even with like beer or things like that,
some
forms of alcohol.
Right, and so they, as a matter of almost Darwinian, it still involved mind, but the behavior was affected by this in ways that responded to the fact that there was disease. And if they had just thought it out in this way, we could have had all sorts of semi-cult religious sorts of things that might have been very, very effective. We don't know the reason for this, but by golly, you better boil these wound wrappings before you apply them, things like that.
We'll pour wine over your wounds.
Right. So they do get, the alcohol angle. That's a major one where it worked right. Now, one thing that's I think the history of science, which I do not claim to be knowledgeable about, but I think it's really a wonderful, interesting, and important thing. And one thing that I think was ignored until probably the late 20th century is the role of folk wisdom and folk medicine, especially as practiced by women. That when rational medicine came along as the macho male thing, that I think it's pretty well established that a whole lot of expertise just got wiped off the table, namely what the wise women were doing in terms of medicine. That was beneath notice.